Welcome to the November Alumni Lunch and Learn for the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at Virginia Commonwealth University. My name is James Wazalewski, and I'm the Director of Development for the Wilder School. Thank you so much for joining us today. Our session today will feature our guest speaker, Dr. Bob Holsworth, as well as our moderator, Mr. Bill Leighty, for the presentation and discussion, Election 2020 and Beyond, What Happened and What Happens Next. As a reminder, we are recording this session as well as a Q&A portion after the presentation. This includes comments in the chats. We are pleased to have each of you here for our session as we continue efforts to engage and involve our alumni and our community. At this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Susan Gooden, Dean and Professor at the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs. Dean Gooden.
Thank you so much, James, and welcome everyone. Delighted that you have joined us for this month's Alumni Lunch and Learn. And I know we all look forward to hearing Dr. Holsworth's take on the 2020 elections and what that means for the Commonwealth of Virginia and beyond. Before we get to that, I just want to say a couple of things about the Wilder School. First, hopefully many of you received our latest copy of Wilder School in Action. Lots of great things that are going on. So hope you have an opportunity to read through that, see some of the great work that our faculty and that our alumni are doing. There's a featured article there from Governor Wilder as well. And you should have also received it electronically. So you have the electronic version and the print version. And the second thing that I want to say, this is our last Alumni Lunch and Learn session for 2020. And as we move into this season of Thanksgiving and as well as the holiday season, I wanted to take a moment to thank each of you for all of your engagement and your continued engagement with the Wilder School, particularly this year. We know that this has been a year of change, but it's also been a year of silver linings. And one of the silver linings has been this virtual alumni lunch and learn session that we started, and a great way to engage with each of you. And I really appreciate all the support that you've given to us. Maybe it was an email or a phone call, checking in to see how we're doing. As I've reported on other sessions, things are going well for the school, and we really appreciate all your support. I also would urge you to say, particularly for our students, because you know that we have a lot of first-generation college students. So I ask you to consider making a gift to the Wilder School before the end of the 2020 year. Before you see our web page, and if you go to the web page, you'll see a gift box in the upper right-hand corner. All you have to do is to click on that gift box, and you'll get a drop-down menu, and you can decide which fund you want to give to. Perhaps you want to give back to your program that you received a degree, or perhaps you want to designate your gift to direct support for our students. You'll have a number of options there, even one that's named an endowed scholarship for today's speaker, the Bob Holsworth Graduate Student Enrichment Fund. So we just ask you, our students are struggling. Some of them are unemployed. Some of them have really faced a lot of hardship, and they're continuing to try to complete their degree and to go on with their careers. And any support that you can give, no gift is too small. I really appreciate any consideration that you can give to giving back to our students and to investing in their success. So with that, I will say again, thank you for joining us for today's Alumni Lunch and Learn, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Bill Leighty, who will introduce today's guest speaker.
Thank you, Dean Gooden, and welcome to everybody to the Wilder School Lunch and Learn Election Coverage 2020 and Beyond. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend and my business partner, Dr. Bob Holsworth, a man who doesn't need any introduction to this particular group, that's for sure. Many of us know Bob as the founding director of the Center for Public Policy at the L. Douglas Wilder School, and as the former dean to Humanities and Social Sciences, the largest university deanship at VCU at the time. We also know Dr. Holsworth as a renowned speaker on all things political in the Commonwealth of Virginia. As Bob's business partner, I spend a lot of time with Bob, and I get to see him make a lot of presentations. And each and every time I am amazed and wonder, how is it possible he knows all that stuff, can make all those wonderful connections, and give us such great insight of the world of politics of Virginia. So I'm looking forward to today's presentation as much as you are. I'd like to remind everyone that this session is being recorded. Of course, none of you will be recorded because we don't see you, but it is being recorded, and we invite you to put your questions to Dr. Holsworth, either using the chat room or the Q&A section at the lower right-hand side of your screen. With that, I will turn it over to my friend, Dr. Bob Holsworth.
Bill, thank you very much for the wonderful introduction, and thanks to everyone who is here. And largely what I'd like to do today are really very quickly 4 things. First, I'd like to talk through the federal elections, what really happened there, and what we might expect going forward. Secondly, talk about, address what happened in Virginia in the statewide elections and the congressional elections. Thirdly, give a brief explanation of what happened in the Richmond mayor's race, as far as I can tell. And then finally, address where we might be going forward in Virginia in 2021, because we're a state that has an election every year, something I call the political pundits full employment policy. So let me just begin with the federal elections. As far as I can see, the presidential election certainly is over, that Joe Biden has 306 electoral votes. President Trump is not conceding. He's not enabling the transition to go forward. But in terms of any capacity he has to change this, I think it's running out very quickly right now. The legal challenges don't seem to be going anywhere, largely because the attorneys are not able to show the irregularities and the problems with votes that could really turn around any of these elections. And then secondly, the recounts that will occur. We expect the Georgia recount to simply confirm the results, and the Trump team has to decide whether it wants to spend approximately $8 million on a recount in Wisconsin that is even more unlikely to change the results. So ultimately, I think the election is over, and Donald Trump was defeated. Now, what happened in this defeat? I think a couple of things. Joe Biden was able to rebuild that blue wall in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And beyond that, he was able to extend into Georgia and Arizona. In terms of what he was able to do and why, there's probably multiple reasons. First, I would suggest that the turnout that had been lowered, particularly in some of the core cities, was higher again, though Donald Trump himself had tremendous turnout in the rural areas. Secondly, the suburban defections that we had seen from the president in 2018 continued, at least with respect to the president, if not with respect to the Congress this time around, and the areas surrounding Philadelphia, Milwaukee, and we saw that in Virginia as well. There is some sense that the president put forward that these suburban areas are primarily white, but I think what you increasingly see in many of the suburbs across the United States is they have a multiracial diversity, and that certainly was not good for the president in this election. And then thirdly, especially in the blue wall states, Biden was able to cut into the Trump vote among working class whites by just a little bit, not very much. Some instances it was 1%, 2% per precinct. But overall in these elections that are relatively close, that added up as well. In Georgia, I think when you go down to those other 2 states, you have to look at the long-term voter registration efforts and voter mobilization efforts that Stacey Abrams headed, that had, I think, a fairly dramatic effect, along with the votes, particularly in the suburbs outside of Atlanta, outside of Savannah as well. In Arizona, what we saw was a significant change in Maricopa County, where you have most of the vote. And in that instance, we saw particularly young Latinos come out and vote in greater number and vote against the president, though that was not the case necessarily nationally. I mean, a couple of the interesting features that we think President Trump overall did slightly better among African-American males than he did in 2016, and that in particular areas like South Florida, we saw President Trump and a couple of the border communities in Texas do very well with Latino voters. So overall, I think when you look at the percentage, it's going to be relatively similar to what happened in 2016. I think the Democrats had been hoping that not only would Donald Trump get defeated, but they would certainly defeat Trumpism and that they would defeat a lot of down ballot Republicans. That turned out, at least at the moment, not to happen. The Democrats right now have picked up 1 seat in the Senate. The Democrats had believed that they were going to pick up far more. You might have remembered that there was discussion about whether they were going to pack the Supreme Court, add justices to the Supreme Court, all premised on the assumption that they would pick up at least these 3 seats. They haven't right now. It's all going to come down to these 2 runoffs in Georgia. The Democrats are hoping that that turnout operation they ginned up for the presidential race can happen again. I'm a little wary of saying that that will happen again, at least because in the runoffs that we've seen in Georgia over the past 15 years, the Democrats have only won 1 of about 7 or 8. The Republicans have done quite well in these runoffs, and we'll have to see whether the Democrats have a strategy that would enable them to change that. Probably the most disappointing feature for the Democrats and most encouraging feature for the Republicans were in the congressional races, where the Republicans are going to pick up 6 to 10 seats, really narrowing the majority that Nancy Pelosi has to operate. In some of those seats, what we saw were seats that the Democrats gained in 2018, sometimes were given back. And some of the suburban voters that voted for Donald Trump, or voted against Donald Trump for president, changed and voted for Republican people in Congress. I think that the Democrats probably did not quite account for how they won some of those seats in 2018. You might recall they won them largely by running candidates, often women, who had backgrounds in law enforcement, backgrounds in the military, backgrounds in Abigail Spanberger in Virginia in the CIA. And they ran sort of what I would call mainstream, fairly moderate center-left campaigns. And I think that some of the rhetoric that surrounded defunding the police or the democratic socialist rhetoric might be very useful for Democrats in mobilizing voters in some areas, but at the same time, in some of these centrist areas, it turned out to be a burden for some of these candidates that they couldn't carry. So at the end of the day, I think the Democrats are extraordinarily happy with the presidential race, disappointed with what happened down ballot. In Virginia, turning here, I think what happened in Virginia more than anything else was that Virginia put a big exclamation point on the changes that have been occurring in the Commonwealth for the past 15 or 20 years. Overall, in statewide races for governor, president, Senate, the Republicans have only won 1 race since 2005, and that was Bob McDonnell in 2009. Since that time, they have really struggled. And they struggled once again on election night a few weeks ago here in the Commonwealth. Joe Biden carried the state by 10 points. Mark Warner carried the Senate race by 12 points. And so it was not only another defeat for the Republicans, but it was just a blowout here in Virginia. And interestingly, in rural areas in Virginia, with the exception of some South Side communities where there are significant African-American populations, Republicans did extraordinarily well. Donald Trump carried some districts that Bill Clinton had carried in 1996 in the far Southwest with 80, 83, 85% of the vote. The challenge, however, is that Virginia, unlike many states, is not a predominantly rural state now. It is an urban, metropolitan, suburban state. And these districts went heavily for Joe Biden. I think Biden carried the 10 largest jurisdictions in Virginia, carried Chesterfield County, the first Democrat to do so in 70 years, 72 years, carried Virginia Beach City, and then carried all the suburban areas. RVA in particular, he carried Chesterfield County, as I mentioned, carried Henrico County by about 40,000 votes. Just large changes that have occurred. And that's what we've seen in Virginia over the past 15 years. The suburban areas, particularly on the eastern side of the state, Northern Virginia, RVA, Hampton Roads, have gone heavily Democratic in this time. Richmond City, is an 85% Democratic city. Henrico, as I said, 40,000 votes. Biden even carried Chesterfield on that front. So, and that is a trend that we've been seeing, and the Republicans have not been able to deal with that. So the challenge for the Republican Party is how in the world can they find a message and candidates that can in some ways succeed in the rural areas of the state with sort of a Trumpian message, but at the same time linked to these suburban areas where they're having big problems. And I would also say that I think that Donald Trump exacerbated the problems that the Republicans have in Virginia. And we've seen that over the last 4 years. You might recall that the message that the president spreads nationally, that he wants to drain the swamp in Washington, is seen almost as a direct assault on the most populous area of Virginia, which is Northern Virginia, which is inextricably tied to the federal government economically. So I joke that instead of draining the swamp in Washington, what the president succeeded in was draining Northern Virginia of Republicans. In the General Assembly right now, there is no Republican who represents Fairfax County, the largest metropolitan area in the state. I mean, the largest jurisdiction in the state. Not a single Republican represents it. And one Republican represents part of Prince William County, another huge county below Fairfax in Northern Virginia. So that is, so what happened here in the statewide races is a punctuation point or an exclamation point was put on this trend. Secondly, the congressional races in Virginia turned out to be status quo. The Republicans had hoped to knock off 2 Democrats, Elaine Luria in Virginia Beach, Abigail Spanberger here. Luria won relatively handily by a little more than she won last time in a rematch with Scott Taylor. And then here in RVA, the Republicans really hoped that they could take the Spanberger seat because it extended not only from Chesterfield and Henrico, but extends all the way up to Culpeper and goes through what you might call part of Trump country in Virginia. And Donald Trump had carried this district by about 5 or 6 points last time. If you saw what happened on election night here, however, that Joe Biden carried this district. Abigail Spanberger ran just slightly ahead of Biden, but basically Trump's decline, especially in Chesterfield County, I think, and he even increased vote in Henrico County, enabled Spanberger to escape and to hold her seat here in Virginia. So that was sort of the second thing that happened. Finally, in Virginia, we had the redistricting amendment that passed, establishing a bipartisan redistricting commission, passed 2-1. It's done that in almost every state that we've seen these redistricting amendments. They pass pretty easily. So I was not surprised that it passed. I am a little surprised, however, that it was actually, that the Democrats actually got behind this and did it, or at least a good portion of the Democrats. They were split this time. But what had happened is the Democratic Party had advanced this idea of a bipartisan commission for a decade, particularly when they were in the minority in the General Assembly. All of a sudden in 2019, they gained the majority. And the question was, would they become hypocrites and basically say, no, we want to go and keep the existing system, or would they actually move in favor of this bipartisan commission? Enough Democrats got behind the bipartisan commission to keep it on the ballot as a constitutional amendment. And as I said, it passed easily. One might congratulate the Democrats for their virtue here in actually doing this, though I would just say that to me, it's almost unimaginable that the Republican Party of Virginia or nationally would have done anything of this sort if they still had the majority. Republicans opposed this strenuously, the vast majority, not all, when they were in power, and then they reversed themselves when they were out of power, and they thought this might benefit them. But the Democrat, I would just say that I know of almost no instance where a political party gains control of a legislature for the first time in a generation, and as one of their initial moves, then concedes one of the greatest powers that they actually have. So I think one can congratulate the Democrats on good government. It'll be interesting to see whether over the next few years they regret the decision they made to do that. Finally, or thirdly, let me talk very quickly about the city of Richmond mayor's race. I felt that LeVar Stoney was the favorite. Certainly 9 months ago, he would have been a heavy favorite. The question was he going to remain the favorite after both Navy Hill and the protests that occurred, the social justice protests that occurred after the George Floyd killings and the other issues that emerged throughout the country this summer. He had a number of challengers. The two strongest challengers were Kim Gray, a city councilwoman, and Alexis Rogers, a sort of a newcomer to Richmond politics who in many ways tried to become and I think successfully became the progressive alternative to the mayor. Kim Gray, very quickly, I thought just ran a miserable campaign. My sense was that her campaign appealed primarily to the people who disliked the protests in Richmond because of some of the destruction that occurred to the local businesses and didn't like the mayor's response to COVID. And then she argued in many of her mailers about that LeVar was going to raise your taxes again and things of that sort. My sense was that why this was terrible, it was that Richmond's an 85% Democratic city. And I just think that she abandoned in some ways some of her strongest arguments that she had to appeal with her work in trying to rename the boulevard to Arthur Ashe Boulevard. Some of the work that she had done over the years seemed to be subsumed or kind of put on the back burner when she appealed, I think, primarily to the Republicans in Richmond. And so she wound up coming in third in terms of the popular vote. Alexis Rogers, she was the candidate who really came out of, I think, the Navy Hill debacle, where the mayor was actually not able to push that through because of the grassroots opposition that developed in the city. Rogers, I thought, ran a pretty good campaign for an absolute newcomer who no one knew. She got more votes, slightly more votes than Kim Gray. She did win districts, but at the same time, if you saw the mayor, he had more money. He's a visible mayor. He's out in the community. He ran on taking down the monuments. If you saw his ads, he talked about how he had removed the monuments. And it's not surprising at the end of the day, he did extraordinarily well in most of the majority African-American districts in the city. So he wins and keeps his political future, I think, as a potential statewide candidate alive. Finally, just coming up to 2021, it's going to be a remarkable year in Virginia. I think almost 35 or 36 people have announced that they're running for or considering running for one of the statewide offices in the Republican Party. The two most prominent people who've announced so far are Amanda Chase, who is a senator from they hold a primary, but even there, she'll get part of that Trump vote that exists in Virginia. and she would have no possibility, I believe, of beating almost any Democrat in a statewide race, because it would reinforce all the problems that I mentioned earlier the Republican Party has. Kirk Cox, former Speaker of the House, is running. I thought it was interesting that a lot of people said he's going to run as a moderate Republican, but if you take a look at his announcement yesterday, the video that was close to his announcement, that was driven by his concern, I think, that he has to beat Amanda Chase. And so this was a video shot in front of, in part of the video shot in front of stores that are boarded up in the city of Richmond, arguing that he's against big city elites, that he is going to really be against the sort of all the trends that are going on in the cities. And my sense is that that is far more directed toward a Republican primary voter or a Republican convention goer than it is the voters who are going to make up the vast majority of the constituency come November. The Democratic Party, if they have an issue in Virginia, it's really trying to negotiate a path forward between their moderate pro-business base, that is their traditional base, and the progressive side, particularly in Northern Virginia, that is gaining more influence and clout. There's 4 people who are likely to run for governor. Terry McAuliffe, I think, will get in, the former governor. And then there'll be 3 African-American candidates. Jennifer McClellan, very popular political figure, state senator from our area. Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax, and Jennifer Carroll Foy, a delegate from Prince William. McAuliffe, I think if he announces, is going to have a lot of money, a lot of support. He's kind of a traditional Democrat, as I would say, in Virginia, the kind that's been successful over the last 15 or 20 years in gubernatorial races. He's pro-business, pro-economic development on the business side, but liberal and progressive on social issues. That's been a good formula for the Democrats. I think that's not all that distance from the formula that Jennifer McClellan would recommend. I think she's trying to sort of inch herself over to a more progressive orientation, particularly on climate and environmental issues there. Justin Fairfax, who at one time I thought would be a shoo-in for governor because he's such a bright, talented guy, has had, I think, enormous trouble fending off the implications of the allegations of sexual assault and rape that he had from 2 women. He says they're absolutely unfounded, that he has been treated unfairly. It's a real question, though, whether Democrats would think he's the best choice. Finally, Jennifer Carroll Foy will have support from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. She's from the city of Petersburg, as is Jennifer McClellan, grew up in the projects there, and became one of the first African-American women to be at VMI. She's become a real progressive voice for labor, for minimum wage issues, and for social justice issues in Virginia. And she will actually receive some funding from some of the people such as Sonia Smith and Michael Bills, who've been funding progressive candidates in Virginia. My sense is that McAuliffe probably is the favorite, though at the same time, there are a lot of Democrats who really like Jen McClellan and would hope that, that Terry McAuliffe doesn't get in and give somebody else the opportunity to run. And a lot of Democrats really think it is time, as they've seen across the country, for women to have more of a say in the power circles of the Democratic Party, given that they have been in so many instances the voting base of the party. But in any case, it's going to be a remarkable year. And the big question is whether or not Virginia politics changes in any significant way with a Democrat as president. Does that make it more easy for a Republican to be competitive, or has the identity of the Republican Party become so toxic in the metropolitan areas that things won't change shortly? So that's where I am. I'd love to take any questions or comments that anyone has. Got to unmute yourself. Still muted.
Thank you, Bob. And just to remind everybody, either in the chat or the Q&A, please submit your questions. They're being compiled and forwarded on to me, and I will be asking the questions from here. Let's start, Bob, with one of your former students. Oops. One of your former students, Mark Johnson, who asks, is the 5th Congressional District, the Cameron Webb Good District, even though Cameron Webb lost, is the 5th Congressional District ever vulnerable for Republicans?
That's a great question. This is the election the Democrats had hoped to win, perhaps, that Bob Good, who had knocked off Denver Riggleman in a Republican Party nomination battle, largely because Republicans in that district, a very conservative district, extending from outside, you might say, Liberty University's suburbs all the way up to Charlottesville, had hoped to knock off, he knocked off Denver Riggleman because the Republicans in part got annoyed with Riggleman because he had presided over a gay marriage. And the Democrats nominated a very young, charismatic physician from the UVA Medical Center, Cameron Webb. Webb ran a good campaign, received a ton of money, but lost by about 6 points. So the question is, can that district be changed in that way to make it easier for Webb to win? That's one of the implications of the redistricting issue that I just mentioned. If the Democrats had controlled redistricting, if you didn't have this kind of bipartisan commission that is actually going to, in my way, largely support incumbent protection, given the rules of how that commission is supposed to operate, requiring a supermajority from both parties to actually make a decision on the maps. The Democrats controlled the redistricting, they could change that district, I think, fairly easily and pick up that seat. I think it's going to be more complicated now in this front. It's a very conservative district. Webb ran a great race. There are some South Side districts, rural areas of that district that are predominantly African-American. He did very well there. Plus he did well, obviously, in Albemarle, Charlottesville. But the current makeup of that district makes it very, very tough to do. I think the Democrats feel they might have a chance, Mark, in 2018, because you won't have Donald Trump ginning up all that rural turnout for the Republicans as well. So I wouldn't be surprised to see Dr. Webb back again. But I would say that in its current manifestation, that's a very tough district for Democrats to win.
Thank you, Bob. This question is from Robert Brown, and it touches upon the Spanberger AOC sort of wrestling match within the Democratic caucus. AOC seems to think that one of the things that's happened here in response to Spanberger is that voters need to be more educated on the issues that younger voters and leaders believe are making important for and being left out by the older leaders. Do you want to comment on the internal tussle between the AOC and the Spanberger wings in the Democratic Party?
Yeah, sure. And it's a great question, and it's something the Democratic Party has to negotiate both nationally and inside Virginia between the progressive and the moderate pro-business wing. My sense is that in some sense they're both right. That AOC is correct, that a significant portion of the Democratic base are these are younger voters. They are far more concerned about climate change than older voters. That they are far more interested in, I think, diversity of all kinds on the tickets. I was very much struck, for example, that even though Kamala Harris didn't have a big role in the presidential campaign, when you saw interviews with voters afterwards, how so many people, so many young people supported Joe Biden, I think even more strongly than they might have, largely because they saw Kamala Harris on the ticket there. So in that sense, I think AOC is correct. I mean, the Democrats cannot ignore the group of people who are most active, most energetic, and really contribute to the success of the party in most of the areas of the where the Democrats are strong. At the same time, when you have people like Abigail Spanberger, you have Democrats running for, running in suburban areas that are primarily Republican, or running in areas that are both urban and rural, as you can see in states like Kansas. Those folks have to run different kinds of campaigns to win in some ways. And so for the Democratic Party, they have to be focused, I think, on what their common interests are and common policies. And I think this time, some of the slogans that emerged over the summer may have damaged the Democrats. And I'm thinking of such things like defund the police. And what you had is that you had, I think, a tremendous majority of Americans in favor of reform of the police. But I don't think that you would find the same majority in favor of defunding the police on that front. So as the Democrats negotiate these tensions and divisions, they need to think of how they message to put forward, wherever possible, common visions, rather than ideas that are really going to be divisive and damaging to some people who really want to run as Democrats.
Bob, there are a number of questions here from participants about the lack of the Republican leadership in accepting the results and enabling Trump to continue on with his charade about the fake results. Can you comment on just generally the impact of Republicans' enablement of Trump's refusal to concede?
Yeah, I think it's a real, it's damaging in any number of ways. Certainly it's damaging to the transition for Joe Biden. And beyond just refusing to concede, I think what we're seeing is an effort to light these firestorms, maybe not just here, but around the globe, that is quite troubling. But for the refuse to concede issue, challenge, I think, is that when you have not only the president, but this substantial part of the media outlets that people who support the president watch, making what I think are tremendously unfounded claims about this election, it has the potential, really, I think, to damage democracy in the United States in both the short and the long term. There are a lot of Americans who never, who always thought that, if it wasn't for James Comey, Hillary Clinton would have won. But people were not objecting to the result per se. They were not suggesting that these ballots were, were somehow wrong. And then, and in some instances, it appears to me that it's almost racist in orientation when you have, Lindsey Graham and others talking about, well, what happens in Philadelphia, as if somehow there weren't observers looking at these ballots as they came in, that that you had manufactured ballots, and you have all these rumors now about, ballots shipped in from California to Arizona. I really think it's dependent upon, our democracy, I think, is a little more fragile than we ever imagined. And I think it's really dependent upon the leaders and the participants to uphold the strength of the democracy and the fact that our elections, I think, are remarkably fair and remarkably secure. There can be an irregularity or two, but we're not seeing anything of the caliber that is being suggested by the president. And I don't know exactly how many people will believe it, but I think ultimately it's going to be fairly significant. I saw polls this year, for whatever they're worth, suggesting that almost half the people who supported the president believed his thing that we probably didn't kill Osama bin Laden. So given and that was just a throwaway line. This is going to be weeks upon weeks. And I think this is really damaging, certainly to Joe Biden, but worse than that, damaging to democracy.
Thank you, Bob. Jonathan Kinsey asked about the management of the COVID and how it affected maybe other races across the nation, such as governor races or other Senate races. Let me broaden that just a little bit and ask you to comment on the refusal of McConnell to bring a COVID bill to the floor and how COVID overall might have affected this race.
Well, I think there was a sense that COVID was going to have more of a negative impact on the president's prospects than it did. Now, certainly, I think it didn't help him in these suburbs that I mentioned that were so important. So I think that did harm him considerably in that way. However, when you look at the question that was raised there about McConnell, it's very disappointing and in some ways depressing to watch this, because it really seems to me, particularly now, that what we're talking about is having a bridge to this vaccine that looks like it's going to be very effective and safe sometime next year for the majority of the population. And so what we should be doing now is thinking about how we can walk across that bridge in a way, let us say here in Virginia, that saves the lives of as many Virginians as we can, or saves the lives of as many Americans as we can. And what we do know is that there are certain businesses and certain groups of workers who have been devastated by COVID, largely because they are in industries that have just been hammered, whether that be restaurant industries, hospitality, airlines, and the like. And so I would just think that as a strategy, that we would, in the near term, try to see what we can do to enable and help those people who are most hammered by this problem right now, as the public health measures we need to take as we bridge to the vaccine. And so we should be having support for these workers and support for these business owners, I think, as a bridge to the vaccine. I don't think it's rocket science to believe that. And it's very depressing to see that we have a political system that, at least at the moment, is unable to get there. And what we're watching then are, tens of thousands of people on food lines, tens of thousands of small businesses, wondering, now there's going to be a new restriction on me. How am I going to survive? Because no government or very few governments at the state or the federal level are providing the support that enables them to get through to next summer. And I'm very disappointed in that.
Let me follow up on, because you kind of touched on it there, but Cheryl Bailey asks, given the economic structural change that has occurred, what can you predict will happen to the national voting patterns, national and state voting patterns?
Well, I don't exactly know for sure, because we're always a little confused by it, and I think it's dangerous or it's difficult to actually project how people are processing things. So, in terms of the economic dislocation, some people say that we should accept it, we have to accept it, and if there was enough support for those who are experiencing the real problems of dislocation, they would be fine with it. On the other hand, I think it's very easy to become very resentful about it, and be concerned with the political leaders who are putting this forward. So it seems to me like sort of like a volatile time. We have a more volatile time until we get to this vaccine. And by and large, I think, perhaps the first measure of this is going to be when we look at the Virginia elections next year, because we're one of the few states that have gubernatorial elections. And by and large, I think, one factor will be an assessment of what has the state's response to COVID been. Has it been adequate or not? and what are the parties are saying that we should do going forward to revitalize an economy that certainly is going to have some long-term consequences of what has occurred over the past 9 months and next 6 months going forward, especially I think for small businesses outside of the technology sector.
Thank you, Bob. Bob, here's a really big one. 10 years from now, will there still be a GOP party, or do you think Trump will create his own political party?
That's a great question, because Trump may be one of the few people who could break the stranglehold. But I think if you take a look at what he has done, he came in and he hijacked in 2016 the Republican Party. He took the Republican Party. He beat all of these strong candidates, people who thought were, the cream of the Republican crop, turned them into mush. And then over the last 4 years, reformed the party in his own image. Still up to this moment seems to strike fear in the hearts of most Republican office holders that he might possibly oppose them in some kind of primary run and agitate their voters against him. So in some ways, he is the Republican Party right now, and it's a question about where does the Republican Party go. My sense is that it still is very, very difficult in the United States to form a third party that's going to be successful. And the reason for that is that the two parties are these economic juggernauts as well as political juggernauts. They have tons of money that they raise, that they are able to have staff throughout the country and the like. So if Trump was younger, I would think that maybe he would have that possibility. But my sense is that he is wouldn't have the stick-to-itiveness, I would say, to actually form a new party that could be successful over the long run. He could do even more damage, perhaps, to the Republican Party. But the one thing I would say is that a lot of Republicans look at Trump and say, well, the one thing he has done is that he's brought working class voters back into our camp. So that's a good thing for us, not a bad thing if we can keep that up. My guess is that what you're seeing is that you're seeing a public that really, in some sense, would like a new party, would like something different than what we have. But maybe I'm too much of a status quo person. But it's hard for me to see how the financial stranglehold that the two parties have on political institutions right now go away so easily.
Wendy Vick asks some states.
Bill, could you repeat that? I think we're losing your connection a little bit. Or could someone repeat it?
Yeah, I'm.
Oops. While we're waiting for Bill to join us, let me just ask, there's a question in here from Mark Johnson about, you spoke about McAuliffe and others running for governor. Do you believe that Mark Herring may run? And any thoughts on a run from Herring?
Mark Herring's running for Attorney General again. And there are two other people who have announced they'd like to run. One is Jay Jones, a young member of the House of Delegates from the Norfolk area, whose father, Gerald Jones, had been in the House of Delegates and who is now a judge. Jones has been a leader in the criminal justice reform movement in the House of Delegates. And the second is Shannon Taylor, who's the Commonwealth Attorney of Henrico County. Taylor announced prior to Herring saying that he was going to run again for Attorney General. And I'm not sure she'll stay in. We'll have to see whether she does or not. I don't want to speak for her right now, though. Jay Jones has said he will stay in no matter what with Herring. Herring is, very well liked by a lot of progressives in Virginia because of his stance that he's taking, certainly on criminal justice reform, on gay and lesbian discrimination, abortion rights. I mean, he has been a very staunch progressive as Attorney General, perhaps the most progressive Attorney General that I've seen in Virginia, and pretty popular. Jay Jones, I think, will also be pretty popular as well. If he can raise enough money, that could be a competitive race if it's a two-person race. Shannon Taylor's in the race. I would say that Herring would have a pretty easy road, a much easier road if it's a three-person race. But that is interesting. Herring, decided not to run last time, and now again has decided, particularly with McAuliffe thinking about getting in the race, that he just didn't have a road to the nomination.
Bob, I'm back here. Sorry, I got distracted by a bird flying by my window. Kathy Vick, I don't know whether we got to this one. Kathy Vick asks, the Hispanic vote was fairly split in some major states. How do you perceive the Hispanic vote in Virginia went?
Oh, I think the Hispanic vote in Virginia probably mirrored what it did overall nationally. I think it was probably fairly good for Joe Biden. What we saw was that there were particular places where the Latinx vote was different. Certainly in South Florida, where for many years the Republicans have been advocating against the Democrats, against socialism, democratic socialism, and the like. Particularly in the Cuban American population and the Venezuelan American population, people who have been disgusted with sort of the left-leaning strongmen in Latin America. That had a lot of resonance, and seemed to also have a resonance in a couple of places on the Texas border, where there was actually fairly significant changes from Hillary Clinton to over to Donald Trump in this election. What I think the point that's made there, though, as I said, overall, I think when you get the national numbers, they're not going to look very different. But I think this really should be a message to Democrats that you can't take for granted all minority voters that lean your way, that they're necessarily going to lean that way. There's a substantial social conservatism in the Hispanic community that the Republicans could draw upon. They tend to be very entrepreneurial as well. And just as you see that Trump made some inroads with African-American males. There's one of these political analysts that I follow pretty closely on Twitter, Dave Wasserman, said, if the Democrats, in some ways try to manipulate the vote in Philadelphia County. In Philadelphia, it was one of the, they were totally unsuccessful, because actually it was one of the few districts in Pennsylvania where Trump, in terms of percentage, not overall number of votes, where in terms of percentage actually did a little better this time. So I think those are concerns that the Democratic Party is going to have to address going forward. And the Republican Party, because that's been the part of the Republican Party in these suburbs. The problem in the suburbs is that these suburbs have become multiracial and very diverse. In Prince William County, you probably have 20% of the population African American, close to 20% Hispanic, and a significant portion, maybe 15 to 20% Asian American. And so it's these voters that the Republicans have not done well with in Virginia, and they're going to have to find a way to appeal to them if they're going to be successful going forward. If you look at a county like Henrico, at one time the Democrats did well in Eastern Henrico, but not Western Henrico. But Western Henrico has significant demographic change as well. And you're seeing Democrats do very well in Western Henrico as well. So overall, I don't think you had the particular circumstances in Virginia for the Hispanic vote that you had in other places, but it does send a message, I think, to both parties that you shouldn't take this vote for granted, and there are potential avenues of appeal.
Looks like we may have lost Bill again, but let me ask you, I know we're almost at the top of the hour. Kamala Harris's election as vice president is truly historic, first African-American female. What do you think about the future of her career, and what do you expect from her as a vice president?
Well, that's a great question, and two things. So first, as a vice president, I expect her to be pretty heavily involved in the policy-making side, and I think Joe Biden, has shown that already in terms of, when he was really giving his first speech after claiming victory, they had Kamala Harris speak as well, which was not always the case of a vice president. So I think shows you that Biden certainly wants her to be an active and proactive vice president, and she's going to have a lot of expectations based on that. Secondly, one of the features, of course, that's really unusual, though Biden cannot say he's not going to do this right now, is that he's 77 years old, 78 years old. We're going to have a president who, by the time he comes up for a second term, will be in his early 80s. So there is a real sense that among Democrats that Biden is a transitional president to something else. And no one really knows whether he would run for a second term or not, but certainly Kamala Harris has that potential to run for president, or in worst case scenario, become the president if some illness befalls Joe Biden. So my sense, I think that was, kind of an inspired pick by Biden. And I would just go back to say the importance that African Americans had in this whole presidential race. That first of all, they saved Joe Biden in South Carolina. That Biden had lost Iowa, had lost New Hampshire. Jim Clyburn came and endorsed him. And then he had a huge vote in South Carolina that saved the Biden campaign. And I think a lot of Democrats did not understand, a lot of the Democrats who were running, how important the African American vote ultimately is in Democratic primaries. But this was extraordinarily important, and Clyburn had a great impact. And then when you think of what Stacey Abrams did in Georgia, in turning around Georgia there. So my sense is that what you're seeing was not only tremendous support from the African American community, but now an expectation that based on that support, that there's going to be prominent members of the cabinet, prominent vice president, and prominent policies that certainly enhance the opportunities for African Americans across the country. So I think Kamala Harris is representative of that, and is certainly going to bear both the expectation that she is an active member promoting the policies for the public that was so instrumental to Joe Biden getting elected.
Well, thanks so much, Bob, again, and thanks, Bill, for for both of you in terms of your excellent insights. Bob, this was tremendously informative. I know we all learned a lot. Thank you so much, and we'll continue to see what the future holds relative to the federal elections, and as well as in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So thank you, Bob. We really appreciate your insights and all of your continued engagement with the Wilder School.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to everybody. Hope everybody has a great Thanksgiving.
Be safe, Bob.
Just want the opportunity to say thank you to Dr. Holsworth, Mr. Leighty, Dean Gooden for this absolutely incredible presentation and the conversation, and an incredible thank you and wonderful thank you to each of our participants for today's sessions too. What great questions that we had and discussion as well. We truly hope that you will complete the survey after today's session to help us. This includes suggestions for future topics for our Wilder School Alumni Lunch and Learns. And also, please know that the recording of the session will be made available on the Wilder School YouTube site. This will be shared via email with each of our participants and all of those who registered for this session. Our next session, as I say the date, will be on Wednesday, January the 20th at noon. And that will be featuring VCU President Emeritus and University Distinguished Professor Dr. Eugene Trani and VCU Associate Professor of History Emeritus Dr. John Kneebone, who will be speaking about their new book, Fulfilling the Promise, Virginia Commonwealth University in the City of Richmond, 1968 to 2009, followed by a Q&A session. The session will also be moderated by our own Dean Susan Good. Thank you again for joining us, and we will see you in January.